So without further ado, let's go to the state of Washington and welcome to Clif. Hi, Clif. You're on with Dave and Annie.
How you doing, Dave? Hello, Annie.
I'm good.
Hi,
I was hoping, Manny, we get a little more boost on Clif's side of things so I can get him through a little bit more clear. Okay.
So am I coming through a little bit clearer now?
Something called the WebBot. And just kind of by way of introduction, why don't you give us some background on what this is, how you got involved with it, and more importantly, how you know this device called the WebBot can accurately predict future events.
Basically, it's not a single device. It's a bunch of software that I wrote over a period of years, developed around the idea that humans, whether they realize it or not, are all psychic. At some level, we're just like walking around antennas picking up vibrations from the future. And even if we're unaware of it, we have this sort of little habit of leaking it out in our daily conversations by the words we choose to talk about rather mundane things. So conceptually, you can kind of think that, well, all humans are psychic. It leaks out in their language choices. And we wrote a bunch of software that goes out on the Internet and picks up just all these regular conversations. We don't care who says what to whom. We just care what is being said this week that is using different words about the same subject than were used last week. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's the underlying principle. And it developed over a course of time. I initially started to do it when I realized that the stock market was not based on rationality, and was in fact entirely emotionally driven. I thought, I have a way here of attaching emotions to words. Maybe I could go out with my software and find out what people were thinking about particular stocks and figure out which direction the mass of people might be going with stocks, selling or buying, and get there ahead of them. This being the premise of all stock trading, basically, find the trend and get there ahead of it, right? And so I went out and did a test on it, and I was actually hunting for, this is in 1997, I was hunting for a stock called Sun, Stanford University Network. I was familiar with their products, I knew their technology, and so I used them as a test case of my technology here. Went out and read up millions of records off of the Internet. Now we're dealing in each run with well over 100 million reads, and that's where we find a particular word, and we scoop up that whole web page, basically. So you can think of it as 100 million web pages getting chewed up and eaten and digested into a thick, syrupy mass, and then we sort of spread it out and look for trends there. In 1997, it wasn't quite that large, but even so, I discovered that there was something weird. I wasn't finding a whole lot about Sun, the computing company, but I was finding a whole lot of archetypes that related to people being worried about our sun, the big scary ball in the sky. And that kind of gave me pause, and then I set about doing things a bit differently, kind of, or more or less abandoning the idea of doing any further stock market stuff because I was too fascinated by all this other stuff that was showing up.
Let me see if I can encapsulate this for people who are slow learners like myself. If the average person has a vocabulary of, say, 80 to 100,000 words, but they tend to use 10 to 12,000 words daily, but then those words deviate from normal patterns, isn't that some of what the WebBot looks for?
That's basically the concept, yeah. A native English speaker will have about 100,000 words that are internalized. Our whole project here is within an area that we call radical linguistics. The 100,000 words is chunked into two rather large sets, one of about 80 or 90,000 words and one of about 11 to 12,000 words. The 11 to 12,000 words are the words you would normally use in just regular conversation, getting up, getting coffee, getting to work, that kind of thing. And that set should not vary because every day you got to get up, get to work, get coffee, that kind of thing. But it does vary. And so the words pop in and out of that set, and it's that set that we really watch. And we see, and I just kind of wondered, well, why were people using these words about this particular inane subject instead of the regular words that they used 2 weeks ago? And by tracking these words and attaching emotional quantifiers and qualifiers to them in a method of my own devising, I've been able to forecast based on emotional trends in a broad sense. And we forecast, basically what we're doing is we're looking for archetypes relating to the larger area of emotion that is expressed in daily being human. So we look for fear, joy, this kind of thing, and we are able to predict around the subjects that are sort of sprinkled in those emotional areas that we read.
Are you familiar with the Princeton eggs experiment?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, this almost sounds a little bit like that because just for the listening audience, what they did at listening stations all around the world was hook people up to get their neurological and physiological responses, and baseline them. And they found that 3 to 4 hours before major world events like 9/11, the tsunami of 2004, that people's physiological response levels jumped off the charts. And this happened time and time again. And so is this analogous to the same situation, or you're looking for a change in language?
No, this is exactly. It is very similar to that. Probably operates under the same impetus within being human, and shows up for us because it's language-based and has to go through the complex part of the mind in which words and abstract concepts are formed. It just appears earlier than the information from the egg. So taking the two instances, you cited the attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11 and the tsunami and earthquake in 2004. In the case of the Twin Towers, we were writing about it in July. Posted like July 12th or something of that year, so about 85 or 90 days out. And I knew something was coming, and I knew it was a tipping point. I could tell you from the emotions that life was never going to be the same after that, and that all kinds of other chaos would be related to this. But I didn't have a real clue other than an attack on the money center and some other words in a general sense as to what we were facing. Now, we were a little bit better with the tsunami, but that one was a little bit obscured. That year we had two earthquakes that made the mainstream news. Not only the tsunami, but prior to that, there was an earthquake that emptied out the courthouse in which the Scott Peterson trial was ongoing. Since our work normally relates to the amount of chatter on the internet, if you will, about broad subjects, we have a tendency to pick up the linguistics around subjects rather than an accurate description of the subject itself. So in the case of the Princeton eggs, you can actually say that those people that are responding to the waves in universe are feeling the event a few hours, few minutes of it actually occurring. In our case, it's as though the people are sitting back a little bit more casually and reading the headlines about the event in the future, and it's sort of filtering back to them. So the tsunami, we picked up the language, for instance, specifically wrote about it 8 or 9 months in advance, and used language like 300,000 dead, country knocked back to a previous age, infrastructure destroyed, land rising, land falling, all these descriptors that would later on show up within the mainstream media for weeks and months after the event itself. And in that sense, it was as though we were sort of looking at newspaper headlines that would filter back to us rather than an in-depth, accurate description of the event itself. Make sense?
Could someone have looked at what you wrote in July about the Twin Towers and have extrapolated exactly what the target was?
Now we can all do it from hindsight. Could we have done it ahead of time? Perhaps. But our language then was a little bit less robust than it is now. Our lexicon at the time, we have a lexicon, which is a word list that I got from the Oxford University dictionary. Not the descriptions, just the list of words in English. And it was about 300,000 words, I think, when I started. And I started attaching all of these emotional quantifiers to them. And at the time that we had the event in July where we started writing about it, the tipping point, I hadn't gotten to the T's yet. So I didn't have the word terrorism modeled, or we might have gotten very much more accurate. As close as we came was a military plus accident were the two chief descriptors that we had for whatever was at the core of the event, as well as attack on the money center. And so if I'd actually had more of the lexicon filled in, which it was very tedious, it took me 6-7 years to fill it in. And at that time, by the time we hit 2004, we were a lot more accurate, especially relative to the numeric impact and the infrastructure and so on.
Well, that was like the tsunami report. Didn't that first come in as electrified water?
Correct.
Going, what's electrified water?
Like water. And actually, if we'd interpret it, because we were dealing with archetypes, if I'd interpreted it better, instead of electrified, I would have said force-driven water. Because electricity is in the larger subset of force. And yet, at some point, your rational mind comes on in, and that's usually where I screw up. Because I allow my rational mind to come on in and say, oh, we're getting this thing under force, but it's actually probably a giant electrical storm or something along those lines. But if I just kept with the original language, it would have made more sense, especially in hindsight. However, we did get...
Let me play devil's advocate just for a moment here.
Sure.
Okay, I'm laying with my young son out in the park on the grass, and we're looking up at the cloud formations in the sky, and my boy says, hey, look right there, it's a hedgehog. And I look at it, and I look at it, and I look at it, and I go, yeah, it kind of is. What would you say to the critics who might say that when you look at how the language changed, it might be a matter of suggestion more than it was a matter of prediction.
That would be accurate if we were not intellectually honest and putting our forecast out sometimes years in advance and maintaining that language stream unaltered on the Internet as a historical record, in which anybody can go back and say, yeah, look, here's an article about the event X, and these people had 60, 80, whatever % of the words, the primary descriptors, about this event, and they'd posted it 8 months ahead of time and given us a general timeline for it occurring. Now, sometimes we've been just incredibly accurate. The recent earthquake in China, for instance, I was able to put out a warning some 38 hours in advance of that earthquake occurring, and it was specifically focused on the earthquake. We didn't know where it would be, but we had the approximate latitude, and we had descriptors that later on would come out and dominate some of the mainstream media. These descriptors included things like interrupted wedding. Well, there was a huge there was a large display of photographs 2 weeks after the event. It took that long for the photos to make their way to the Internet about a chapel that was destroyed and all these brides and grooms that had to crawl out in their wedding gear. And that was the interrupted wedding component. We had a lot of the other earthquake elements, as well as knowing it was going to occur that weekend. I mean, we gave everybody a heads up. There was a report at the time. So let's go back to last fall. Did you accurately predict the election and the outcome with regard to the presidential race? Yeah, but we don't really care about that, I'm sorry. The issue there is that politics and religion are so hot emotionally that there's very little nuance. People are it's very absolute. Usually the language being expressed on the Internet relative to any political action is black and white, and it's very much part of the Hegelian dialectic. It's controlled by the powers that be, and they use politics to suck people's energy away from them, basically, because you're the difference between Obama versus McCain is which head of the Hydra do you wish to deal with? It's the same body that's going to consume you. So in our work, we just don't pay much attention to politics. Not at that level. That's very well put. That is very well put. But I would imagine that you deal with the effects of decisions that politicians will make. Oh, no doubt at all. I mean, that's really one of the chief things we're trying to focus on now, because politicians are really adding to the grief that's rolling through everywhere.
Well, you also talk about...
Go ahead, Annie.
Well, you also talk about the powers that be are now beginning to fear their loss of control over humanity. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We started seeing language relative... let me back up a bit and say that I deal in everything in an archetype fashion, and for the psychologists among us, not quite the Jungian archetype, more of an archetype that might be associated with Socratean thought, or perhaps the way novellas might be written, in which you would have a larger archetype, antagonist, protagonist, and so on. So we cluster all the words into these clumps that we call entities, and we assign names to the entities, and so we track this huge entity, which is a giant clump of words, and we call that's called the powers that be. And this represents the what people would call the Illuminati, or the controllers, the Club of Rome, the Council of 13, the 300 families. There's dozens and dozens of names for these people, Bilderbergers, whatever you want to apply. Those are all within the powers that be entity. And about a year and a half or 2 years ago, we started getting hints in the language that was showing up within that entity that the level of fear was starting to rise to the point where it was affecting their level of operation elsewhere. The fear language was spreading throughout their organization, and it seemed to coalesce around around a keyword called loss and separation, which was focused on their ability to control the populace. And curiously, just the other day, I was sent a link, which is now on YouTube, unless it's been scrubbed off, about that shows Zbigniew Brzezinski giving a speech in which he specifically